on the slopes and valleys of the Andes and Himalayas,
Cuidado que no pasen por atrás porque algunas llamas saben patear.
the plains of Africa, and to the jungles of Asia and the Americas. The world's first peoples and their descendants have lived in harmony with nature for centuries. But things aren't like they used to be.
In the two past days, it was a lot of flooding where some people died.
With climate-related disasters often made worse by the encroachment of meat and mining conglomerates on indigenous territories.
Não é somente a questão de pedaço de chão, mas é a nossa vida.
And the planet would not be the same without them. We chat with these communities on the front line of the fight to end deforestation.
Are paper companies in Indonesia working with the government to take over and monetize lands that indigenous people live on?
Yeah, and it happens everywhere.
To find out who is winning the war for the planet's priceless resources.
According to the Environment Ministry in Brazil, there's 33% more deforestation in July than there was in July of 2023. We know the former president, Bolsonaro, allowed companies to cut down trees for various reasons. But is Lula allowing the same thing to happen?
Just 2 degrees is on. Now,
the world's appetite for cheap meat, cheap soy, is impacting the indigenous land and the indigenous territories.
Tem medo também pouco, mas só que a gente não deixa se dominar pelo medo, não. Nós estamos acreditando e nós estamos aí na luta.
this episode is all about communities that have a symbiotic relationship with the environment. Some indigenous peoples rely completely on nature for everything: food, water, medicine, everyday supplies like kitchen utensils made from clay and stones, and clothing made from tree bark and animal skins. But across the planet, they're being persecuted and displaced, which is why there is a World Indigenous Peoples Day. This year's theme is protecting the rights of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact. That refers to the right to autonomy and self-determination. In the past, Native communities have avoided interacting with the outside world because they've experienced violent and sometimes deadly encounters. And in that regard, living in remote, resource-rich forests protects them to some degree and limits the need to leave their lands. The Cree First Nation of Waswanipi in Canada, for example, is a self-governing so-called band or body of indigenous people in Quebec. They've relied on berries, trees, and other plants for food and materials for centuries. They're renowned for their traditional beadwork, which incorporate local flora and fauna. But over the past 30 years or so, the Waswanipi Cree have stood by helplessly as logging trucks encroached on their forests. And today, less than 10% of their ancestral land remains intact. The Tagairi and the Taromenani are indigenous groups in the Ecuadorian Amazon basin. They live in Yasuni National Park and are the last such communities living in isolation in Ecuador. Before making contact with the rest of society, they were feared as formidable warriors, which earned them the names Aucas, meaning savage in Quechua, a Quechua language native to Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. Their reputations may have helped because despite significant pressure from oil industries, they've successfully resisted encroachment through legal challenges, maintaining their autonomy and protecting their ancestral lands. The Anangu people, an Aboriginal group in Australia, achieved a significant victory in October 1985 by reclaiming custodianship of Uluru Kata Juta National Park. This site had long been the focus of conservation efforts and received further protections in 2017, when the National Park Board voted to prohibit tourists from climbing in the area. The board's decision was due to the spiritual significance of the area to the Anangu, as well as environmental concerns. The Toubou are an ethnic group inhabiting northern Chad in Central Africa. They've got a nomadic lifestyle which centers around raising livestock and farming on scattered oases where they cultivate dates and legumes. But August was a tough month for this community, which was faced with deadly and destructive weather and flooding. I rang up a Toubou friend there to find out how things were going.
Floods in central and southwestern Chad have killed scores of people, But the most affected region is where your family lives, which is in Tibesti, the west. How are they, and what's the situation there now?
Now the flood is stabilized, but in the few past days, it was a lot of flooding, where like some people died. We don't know yet the death number count of people who died, but we have a lot of people who lost their camel or habitation. But also we have like some problem, in the north of Chad, we have like some mine who are put in the Gaddafi time, and now they are moving with the floods.
Is what you've seen, that level of rainfall and that level of flooding, is that normal in that part of the country?
It's not normal. In Chad, we have like some flood in the capital, for example, or some area. But in the north of Chad, it's a desert, like, and it's we never have this flood like that. It's the first time we have it.
Has the government done anything to help, and have people been able to go back to their homes?
The road now, it's impossible. You cannot go with the car. But all the indigenous community of Toubou want to have some strategy, and the government now heard the situation, and we hope they will do something to help the people.
Has there been any impact on agriculture?
Yes, a lot, because we have a lot of camel and some dati we use in the north, and now some they are destroyed.
I know across the planet, indigenous people have a really unique relationship with the world around them. Talk about your people's relationship with the natural world.
We are the nomadic people. We live with the nature. For example, we have the camel milk we use a lot, and you bring to the capital and other place. And we have a lot of dati also. But now we try to connect your indigenous mode with other people. Like some people of my indigenous community create an application to translate your language in French and Arabic and English also.
Orangutans are super interesting, right? Well, to raise awareness of the existential threat these primates face, there is an International Orangutan Day. It was first observed on August 19th, 2013, when reportedly came about from a casual Facebook conversation between teenagers who were allegedly frustrated by the feeling that orangutans were doomed to lose their habitats to developers and the palm oil industry. Their concern was picked up by bloggers, environmental groups, and National Geographic, the channel. And that's led to education campaigns, increased fundraising, conservation efforts, research, and more public engagement, including activism and volunteering. In Indonesia, local indigenous communities have been targets of abuse and mutilation for several reasons, with security forces being accused of arbitrary arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings. I spoke with West Papuan researcher and activist Dorthea Wabiser to find out why.
As far as I understand, there are more than 1,300 ethnic groups in the country. What does that figure mean in terms of how much land belongs to indigenous communities versus how much the government controls?
It's very complex situation regarding indigenous people in Indonesia. And I can't say how much land belongs to the country and how much land belongs to the indigenous people, or how much land the country has taken, because for the government, every land is an empty land, so they will use the land as their own needs. The problem with indigenous people situation with Indonesia is that even though Indonesia signed the UNDRIP, they didn't recognize the indigenous people. So because the government's arguments say that not everyone in Indonesia is indigenous people, so it's hard they don't want to acknowledge that there is a specific tribes who own a parts of land, because they say that everyone is indigenous people. So the whole area, the whole land in Indonesia is belong to the country. So until today, there is a struggle between indigenous people and also the government and also other actors from outside the country to stand firm and have to fight for their own land.
Dorthea, in July, 5 members of the Tanah Batak community in North Sumatra were abducted, reportedly by people working for Toubou Pulp Lestari. That's a pulp and paper company that's controlled by Indonesia's second largest paper group. Are paper companies in Indonesia working with the government to take over and monetize lands that indigenous people live on?
Yeah, and it happens everywhere here in Indonesia. So actually, because I work in West Papua here in Merauke to work on the indigenous people of Papua, what happened in West Papua is like it's an impact because the government and the companies already took everything from the forest from Sumatra, Kalimantan, and the last resources they have is in West Papua right now. So here for example, here in Merauke, there is a project where the government wants to build a sugar cane plantation and sugar factory and bioethanol project. They will use 2 million of hectares here. The land is belong to the Malin people, the Malin tribe here, but the government already through this national strategic project, the government already said that we will use 2 million hectares here in Merauke, and they already divide the land towards different sub companies, like private companies and also the companies owned by the government. And yeah, because what I've mentioned before, because we have to ask the government to acknowledge us, and until right now, it's hard for the government to acknowledge the people of Marin. That's why it seems like we don't have much voice to secure our own land here in Merauke. And this happens after the government already destroyed the forest in Sumatra, in Kalimantan, and now we are facing the threats of extractivism here in West Papua. So until now, the whole area of West Papua, most of them are agreeing that we have to do a referendum towards the Indonesian government. But right now, I think there is a struggle and fights between issues. For example, in civic issue, there is a lot of human rights violation. But also, if we talk about social, economic, and cultural issues, there is like a deforestation on an ecocide and genocide here in West Papua. So the movement itself, they're based everywhere in every spot in West Papua, and they support the area where the government sent more and more troops to secure some area, because right now in West Papua, if you talk about what happened in the middle of the island, or we call like the highest part, we have mountains full of gold and copper and stuff. The government sent more and more troops, and the movement were there to help the indigenous people to secure what's inside it. There is an ongoing conflict here, armed conflict between the indigenous people and the movement who secure the land, and also with the military. So there's a very complex situation here in West Papua.
Scientists have warned that the Amazon rainforest was nearing a critical tipping point, with the potential to transform from a rainforest to a barren savanna. The situation there over the past year has been scary, quite frankly. There have been reports of drought, lack of rain, and an uptick in deforestation in July. And what's worse, wildfires burned 17,582 square kilometers so far this year, the most extensive area in more than 2 decades. Because of the extent to which Brazil's economy depends on the Amazon, there are a lot of politics involved in trying to maintain the health of the rainforest. I rang a friend at Mighty Earth, a Brazilian organization trying to secure the Amazon.
A man by the name of Johan Rockström, he's the director of Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He said that the Amazon has already tipped over and that it's no longer a carbon sink. Instead, it's a carbon source. Do you think that's true?
Once the Amazon reaches this tipping point, the forest will never be the same. The forest will be changed forever. And that's the most horrible situation that we can face. And yes, we are approaching this tipping point. We are approaching this tipping point once again, because the appetite of the world for cheap commodities, for cheap minerals, and for the lack of protection of the territories, not just the indigenous territories, but also the protected areas, the environmental protected areas that we have in Brazil.
Lula has been president again for, 18 months now. Based on his promises, based on the type of president he is, would you think things have been going well for Brazil's climate since he became president again?
So talking about climate situation in Brazil, it's a little bit contradictory, because at the same time we have some extreme climate events in Brazil, like we had the floods in the south of Brazil last April. We are having a big dry in the Amazon now in the coming months. We have a lot of fires in the Pantanal as well. So there's a lot going on in terms of climate change in Brazil right now. But the government is still trying to keep the issue of climate change and the climate negotiations on the top of their agenda. So our Congress is not really a climate action Congress. So there's a lot of work for Lula to negotiate it in the national level.
We know the former president, Bolsonaro, allowed companies to cut down trees for various reasons. But is Lula allowing the same thing to happen? Why has there been more deforestation?
We are facing now a lot of deforestation in the Cerrado. What I heard is like the deforestation in the Amazon is dropping down, especially if you compare to the last years. But the deforestation in the Cerrado is the driest savanna in Brazil. It's getting higher. So the problem now, we should keep our eyes into the Cerrado to see what's going on in the Cerrado and why the deforestation is getting high on the Cerrado.
How have indigenous people in Brazil been coping with what's been happening, the drought, the fires, the deforestation?
The indigenous people, they represent like 5% of the world's population, and they live, and 80% of these indigenous people, they live in the most biodiverse area in the planet. Just in the Amazon, we have around 408 indigenous different peoples, you know. So we are talking about different cultures and different ways of living.
Can you tell us what's happening with them? How are they coping right now because of everything that's been happening?
The main challenge of these indigenous people is to keep the integrity of these areas. And these areas are receiving a lot of threats, like, for example, soy production, the beef production, mining production as well. There's a lot of threats that are pushing these areas. For example, at My Turf, we make analysis of the beef supply chain of the biggest meat company in Brazil, JBS, and we had a really small sample of farms, just 22 farms, and we analyzed those farms, and all those farms, they have recent deforestation cases, and around 7 of those farms were connected with cases of invasion of indigenous lands. So this is an example of how the world's appetite for cheap meat, cheap soy, is impacting the indigenous land and the indigenous territories.
Do you think Brazil's indigenous people could help reverse the damage?
I would say, like, the most important thing to do to protect the indigenous people and to keep their role of protecting the Amazon is to keep the integrity of their territories, but also empowering the indigenous leaders, empowering the governance of these areas. Once they will have, let's say, a comfortable life into the indigenous territories, they'll be much more able to keep the fight to protect their territories.
That's our show, and I guess it's only appropriate I leave you with a look at the beauty and elegance of the various indigenous groups, without whom the planet's last remaining land-based carbon sinks and the natural areas may very well be overrun by unscrupulous big money corporations.